Hello everybody and welcome back to the final intro video for Phil 375. This is the week where we're going to be revising on the basis of feedback that's hopefully coming up now in the peer feedback discussion post on Canvas. I've been following along with the groups, and I've seen that quite a few of you have posted up your drafts, and a good number now are also starting to get feedback to the other people, the other folks in their group. So if you haven't done that yet, the deadline for giving feedback to your group is Wednesday, so end of day Wednesday. And after that, so the final Wednesday to Wednesday will be the time during which you will be revising your draft into the final form based on feedback from the folks in your group. So this video, all I'm going to do is talk a little bit about that process of revision based on feedback. And how I think, what are some strategies that you can use to go about maximizing the opportunity you have to make improvements there. What else do I need to say at this point? I've sent a follow-up email. I've noticed that there were just a few people who didn't put their drafts on Canvas yet. I sent a follow-up email earlier today, so it's not very many, but if that's you, please get your draft up there. It's getting late now for folks who are needing to give you comments. And of course, if it comes very late and you aren't able to give comments, that's okay, I understand. The timing would be quite tight at this point. And what I'll do is when you submit your final submission, remember you're going to be gathering up all of the feedback that you gave as well as all of the feedback that you received, and you just put that all into one document and upload it all at once for the final submission. And if you didn't get very much feedback, you won't be penalized for that, don't worry. So I will take into account that some people just may only have one or two sets of comments from other people in the class, and that's okay. Okay, so when you have your comments in hand, as some of you might already by now might already have comments, you want to read them obviously carefully and thoroughly, but what I would recommend is also trying to read them and then walk away and then read them again with a little bit of breathing time in between, just because sometimes it can help to let something settle a bit in the back of your mind, rather than sort of reading them and instantly going in to make revisions. I tend to find when I do the second thing, if I read a piece of feedback and I immediately go in to revise my piece of writing that I'm working on, I'll do sort of knee-jerk reactions and things that are a bit unprocessed, under-thought out. And if I let things settle for a little while, I have a much better chance of being able to really use the feedback someone's given me. So if you can, that's my advice. You'll have a week from Wednesday to Wednesday for this process. So if you're looking at the comments on the first day, one good strategy is to read them on the first day and then sleep on it before you do anything. Sleep on it, come back to them the second day, and read them again. If you possibly can, I do advise it. Second thing to say, this is very important. You don't have to make every change someone suggests to you to make. The purpose of feedback is not to let someone else have free rein to change your work in any way that they want to, or to give someone else executive decision-making control over your piece, which is not how this stuff works at all. The purpose of the feedback process is for you to get advice, and then part of your skill as a writer comes through in your judgment in deciding what you're going to do with that advice. So all this to say, you have to use your own judgment to take what works in the feedback that you get and make changes as appropriate based on that. And so this is partly a question of this is partly also why I say, if you can, give it a minute before you start making revisions, because you need to kind of hone the instinct of being able to distinguish between something that genuinely improves the work and something that is coming from just a different perspective that's not the one that you want. It's not authentically resonating with the thing that you were trying to do in the first place. And that's not, that can happen for all kinds of reasons. Maybe someone misinterpreted you, or maybe someone just thought you were doing something a bit different, or maybe you just have a difference of opinion about what would be best. That's absolutely fine. Very reasonable. People can disagree about what works and what doesn't in a piece of creative writing. So you don't have to agree with the person who is giving you feedback, and you don't have to follow all of their suggestions or do everything that they think would be a good idea. And you don't want to. Part of the reason not to do that is because it can lead to this sort of artificial insertion of somebody else's voice or vision or vocabulary or anything else into an otherwise smooth and continuous flow of your own voice and vocab and vision and so on. Lots of other words that begin with V. So that just looks a bit artificial if you just go through and make changes like based on one other person's suggestions, or if you do it with two other people's suggestions, you might end up with this weird sort of patchwork effect. So the better strategy is to try to digest the feedback for yourself and think about the whole piece plus the feedback that you've got as a kind of holistic grouping. So you want to see how to incorporate changes that have been suggested to your mind by the feedback that you think would actually work. Okay, this is all much easier said than done, by the way. It's fine. One thing for me to sit here saying this, it's not easy to do it, and I know this firsthand, and so don't don't worry if this sounds or is challenging. It's meant to be. It's a tricky thing. So one thing, in terms of strategies for doing this, one thing that I do suggest is trying a few different options. So if you're considering editing, I mean, this works for any kind of editing really, but especially on the basis of someone else's feedback. Say you're considering removing a sentence or replacing it with a different sentence. And what you could do is try a version where you just remove the sentence, a version where you replace it with something else, and then a version where you replace it with something else, something else. And then, take all three of those and try to read the whole piece again with each alternative in that place where that sentence was. Part of the reason for doing that is because, as I was saying, you need to think about this as a whole. You need to think about your piece as a whole and not just a line-by-line editing process. If you just think on the kind of line-by-line editing scale, what can happen is that you change something at that scale that sort of messes things up a bit at the larger scale. Just to give you an example, suppose you had a very nice paragraph, it was beautifully written, and then somebody came along and suggested, well, I don't really like your word choice in the third sentence. I think you should use a different word. Instead of pretty, you should use a more interesting word instead of pretty in the third sentence. And so you think, yes, that's a good point. I do actually think I should use a different word. And so you put beautiful in there instead. But you don't look at the bigger picture, so you don't realize that actually a couple of sentences later, you've used the word beautiful again. And so now the whole thing is going to read as being a little bit repetitive. It's going to have that sort of close repetition of beautiful that you didn't intend, and it's giving an effect that you didn't want to create. That's the kind of thing that I mean when I say zoom back out to the whole piece when you're considering changes, when you're considering small-scale edits. But so try out a few different options for the change, and then read each of those new versions, if you can, if you've got time, this is the ideal thing. Read them all the way through with the changes that you're considering, and play around with different options for how you want to do your edits. When you're doing that read-through process, the one fairly standard piece of advice is to try reading it aloud, because it helps you to slow down and read the thing more carefully, which is good advice, and that is a good thing to do. But what I do, and I find even more helpful, is to have the computer read it to me, because then I will hear things like little mistakes, or like a repetition of beautiful when I didn't want a repetition of beautiful, or something like that. I can hear it with my ears much better than I can see it on the page. And so if I was to read it aloud for myself, I'd still probably see the thing with the mistake as if it was fine. And so I wouldn't get the same effect. Maybe I would notice a repetition, but I might not notice a grammatical error, or that I missed a word or something like that, if I was just looking at it and reading it out, because I might just read out the correct version thinking that's what I had written. Whereas if the computer reads it to me, my ear will immediately hear that there's a word missing, or there's a grammar mistake, or whatever. I think this is not just me, I think this is for a lot of people, your ear is better than your eyes at noticing small mistakes and just things that don't quite flow the way you want them to, and things like that. Problems with rhythm, or the pace, maybe, of your story. It's often just a little bit easier to hear them. And so if you can, get your computer to read it to you. That's what I recommend. The other thing you can also do, of course, and this is a useful penultimate step, is to have someone else read it for you. And get someone that you trust, but someone who's also honest. You don't want someone who's just going to say, yeah, it's lovely. You want someone who will point out where work is needed, if possible. And this is getting someone to do this is absolutely not cheating. This is very much part of the process of creative work, creative writing. So if you can find someone who's willing to do that with you, maybe exchange your penultimate version with another person who also needs a proofreading favor, highly recommend it. If you have a family member, friend, or someone else in the class that you might be willing to swap with you for one last read through, it's very, very helpful to do as much of that as you can. Okay, so let's see, what have I missed? Changing, editing, thinking about the bigger picture, final proofreading. Yes, now this is sort of along the same lines as thinking about the bigger picture, but I wanted to break that down actually into a little bit more detail. And so this is sort of, I'm going back here to something that I've talked about a little bit before when we were doing some of those earlier writing exercises, but the point very much still applies, that you want to be thinking about your writing on all of these different scales, so from the word to the sentence to the paragraph to the entire piece. So that's if you're writing prose, which I think the majority of people are writing prose fiction. So when I'm talking about looking at the bigger picture and checking that your edits don't mess something up, I'm talking about all of those scales. So if you've edited a word, you need to look at the whole sentence and the whole paragraph and the whole story to check that you haven't messed something up at any of those other scales. But similarly, if you move a paragraph around, then you might need to edit some of the words or sentences in the paragraph, just so that the order makes sense given where the paragraph is now. So at every step you need to try to have, and as far as possible, have all four scales in mind, or at least run through the four. It's a little bit hard to do all four literally at once, but go through all four: word, sentence, paragraph, whole thing, every time you're considering an edit. For poetry and other forms, and I know I was really happy to see quite a few people are writing poetry or song lyrics or other genres like that, so not prose. if you're doing it, if you're doing that, the same kind of point is going to apply. It's just your units might be slightly different. So instead of going word, sentence, paragraph, whole thing, you're probably going to think more about the word and then the line as the next biggest unit, the line of a poem or a song, and then the stanza or the verse in a song, and then the whole thing. So you're still thinking about the same 4 levels or scales: the word, the line, the stanza, the whole poem, or the whole song. But so the 4 scales are slightly different scales because poetry and prose are just slightly different entities. But the same point applies. So if you change, especially with poetry, if you change a word in a poem, you're typically that's really going to impact the entire poem in potentially quite drastic ways, because in poetry each word does a lot of heavy lifting. That's why there aren't so many of them. Okay, the final thing that I wanted to say is that the editing process, while it can be a little bit of a drag, let's be honest, it's not the most exciting, fun part of writing, at least for me and for most people. I think it's not the most creative or inspiring thing to do, to have to go back to something you've already written and go back to the grindstone, try to get in there and make small improvements. But it is actually where most of the work of writing well is done. For almost everybody, first drafts don't come out beautiful and perfect. That's not really a thing. Instead, what happens is a first draft comes out, and the main thing about it is that it exists. That's the main criterion it has to meet: existence. And then everything else, like quality and effects and emotional resonance and intellectual depth, most of that comes in the editing process. Most of those effects are created and added in by the slow and careful process of revising, getting feedback, revising again, trying different things out, and it's a very slow and incremental process. And the skill of editing is one of the most underappreciated things in the world of writing. Humble opinion, but I think so. The skill of editing is a huge deal, but it's not glamorous, and so it's more fun to think of someone being an absolute creative genius and just tossing off this wonderful glowing prose that's instantly a bestseller. But the reality is nobody does that. Nobody works like that. It's a very slow process of editing, and that is like the alchemy that changes the sketchy first draft into the lovely, polished literary masterpiece at the end. So it is really, in some ways, it's the key part of the writing process. Or that's what I think, anyway. So the skill you need to develop here is largely one of learning to trust yourself. And just to sort of, now I'm circling back around to the first thing I said, because you don't have to make every change that someone else thinks you should make, the skill is discerning which ones and how to change something in response to someone else's idea. What the trick here, or part of the trick, is trying to distinguish between something that's in your current version that was a mistake or just a first pass that you can improve upon, and someone noticing that and telling you and saying, you can improve upon this, or I think you made a mistake, versus someone who is suggesting that you move in a different direction that doesn't actually represent your own idea or your own voice. So the first thing you want to make some kind of change in response to. The second thing, you might not. It might be more kind of useful feedback in that it helps you to understand how a reader might interpret the piece that you're writing. And that might inform some of your choices, thinking again kind of holistically about the work. It might inform some of your choices maybe about how to frame it. So maybe instead of changing the final sentence to clarify what this reader thought was going to be the ending, you add something that, at the beginning, that explains that that's not the intended ending at all, right? So in taking somebody else's feedback to heart and using it, you want to trust your own sense of what the piece is doing, and then from that place you can work out how to make the best use of the feedback that you're getting. So yes, so I'm not going to, basically, all this to say, I'm not going to be going through and checking if you made every correction that everyone suggested to you, and then giving you full marks if you did that, because that's really not the process at all. That would be a very mechanical thing to do, and it's not particularly useful. It's not the skill we're trying to improve at, or trying to learn, and that skill is a much more complicated and difficult to it's a much more complicated skill and much more difficult to describe in a 20-minute video, alas, but I'm doing my best here. So yes, the difference between a mistake or something that you didn't really want and just something that somebody else saw differently from you, both kinds of feedback could be useful, and they could lead you to change something, but what you might change could look very different. If someone finds a mistake, you correct it. If somebody finds says something about you, the way you've used the language in a sentence that you thought meant something, it doesn't mean it, or it doesn't suggest the right things, you might want to change that. But if someone just has a different take on the entire piece, or has a different feeling about it, you might not want to change things that they're suggesting in response, although you might want to change something else that would maybe, it would maybe steer them off from that particular reading, or help to kind of guide more in the direction of what your original vision for the piece was. So I hope this is all making sense. It's not easy. It's not an easy process. And so I'm wishing you all the best of luck with it. If you have any queries, any questions, anywhere along the way, feel free to get in touch with me or the TAs. We're all here, we're all available, we're all rooting for you. We're so close to the final finish line now. And yes, we are going to be grading the entire draft plus feedback plus final submissions all together at the end. So you will get grades on all of that after the end of the course. I won't be able to get, just because of the timing, I'm afraid, I won't be able to get grades on the drafts back to people before the end of, before Wednesday the 14th, which is the last day of term. But that will all come as part of the final overall grade. Hopefully everybody, or nearly everybody, has gotten essay grades and feedback by now. I know there are a couple of outstanding ones from people who had extensions, but if you are expecting and haven't yet heard back on the essay, ping me an email, and I can follow up and just see what the timeline is there. So hopefully get you a little bit of feedback on that part at least. And I think that's everything that I needed to say for this week. Yes, I'm very inspired by what I'm reading so far. Your drafts look wonderful and fascinating and beautiful, and in some cases very moving, and in some cases very funny. And yeah, I'm really kind of I'm really inspired by this class and what you all are creating. And I have seen as well some very good feedback going on. Just as I say, I haven't seen lots and lots of it yet because it's still, we're still in the process of getting it all posted. But what I've seen has been very, very high quality. So this is really heartening because it's nice to see that you all are you understand this process of giving and receiving feedback so well and so effectively. Because as I said, it's not easy. None of this is easy. All right, but I'm sure you're going to do a great job, and I will actually do a wrap up on Friday of this week. Probably not because there's much to wrap up or much to say, but just to make sure that we all know where we are in terms of the timeline and to keep everything on track. So I'll just upload a little audio file on Friday, so watch out for that. And yeah, I think that's it. All right, so best of luck with the final stages of revision. I will leave the thread, the peer review thread open. And so just in case, I was actually going to take it down on Wednesday, but then I realized people might want to keep having potentially discussions back and forth with the folks in their group, and that's absolutely fine, and it could be useful to keep those discussions going if you want to. So I'll just leave the peer feedback discussion thread open for the rest of the course, alongside that general thread that you can use if you have any other questions or you just want to float any ideas or mention anything else that's on your mind. All right, and with that, have a great week. I know it's a short week, just a 4-day week, and then we've got 3 more days of the following week, and then it's the end of the course. All right, so yes, enjoy this week, and I will be back on Friday.